Hello, everyone. We have over 100 people from 31 countries who have registered to participate in the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals webinar series on Safer Pharma. We are delighted to have all of you. I'm sure that this will be worth your time today. The webinar, Safer Pharma, How Healthcare Can Reduce Pharmaceutical Pollution, will include 3 speakers today, which I will introduce a little bit later after I have introduced the network of Global Green and Healthy Hospitals. There will be time following the 3 presentations for questions and answers. At any time during the presentation, if you have a question for one of the speakers, please write it in the chat box. As our first speaker, Dr. Tim Oosterbeek, has a quite technical presentation. If there are some technical clarifying questions, we'll take 1 or 2 of them immediately following his presentation before the next 2 speakers, if it makes sense in terms of clarifying before the next session begins. Again, welcome. My name is Susan Wilburn. I'm the Sustainability Director for the Network of Global Green and Healthy Hospitals, and I'll be your moderator today for this webinar. We are very pleased to collaborate together between the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals and the Healthcare Without Harm Europe office for this webinar, which has been supported financially from the European Commission. And as you see on the first slide, Healthcare Without Harm Europe and GGHH are responsible for all of the content in this webinar. The views expressed do not reflect the official views of the European Commission. The Global Green and Healthy Hospitals and Healthcare Without Harm have been created to further engage the health sector in understanding and acting about this link and connection between health and the environment. Last week in Geneva, the World Health Organization just completed the World Health Assembly, where in many of the deliberations there was a discussion of the fact that the environmental burden of disease, that 23% of the diseases and deaths globally are attributable to preventive environmental factors. And while that's a daunting statistic, what it means for us is that almost a quarter of all illness in the world can be prevented by our actions to promote environmental responsibility. That is why we have created this network of Global Green and Healthy Hospitals that now includes over 20,000 hospitals and healthcare centers in over 40 countries globally. The Global Green and Healthy Hospitals is a worldwide community of hospitals, healthcare systems, and organizations, all dedicated to reducing the ecological footprint of healthcare operations while promoting environmental and public health in their communities, so that we lead by example to demonstrate sustainability. We have a 10-goal framework in the GGHH agenda. You can see the slide now showing the 10 goals that include leadership, chemicals, waste, energy, water, transportation, food, green buildings, and green procurement, together with the subject of today's webinar, pharmaceuticals, with the goal to prescribe appropriately, safely manage, and properly dispose of pharmaceuticals. There are, for members of GGHH, many resources and benefits included in this global learning community with guidance documents, case studies, self-assessment checklists, and as we have today and every month, an educational webinar. We're delighted to have you with us for this webinar. You will receive an evaluation in your web server at the end, and we will be very interested to hear from you what other topics for webinars would be of interest. Now moving to the session for today, Safer Pharma, How Healthcare Can Reduce Pharmaceutical Pollution. The goals of the webinar over the course of the next hour and 20 minutes are to raise awareness about pharmaceutical pollution and its waste, to educate health professionals and health workers about simple practices that can help reduce unnecessary pharmaceutical emissions in the environment, with an emphasis on reducing unused and expired medications. Describe how healthcare professionals can educate our patients about pharmaceutical pollution and what the community can do, and discuss policy measures for reducing pharmaceuticals in the environment in the European Union and globally. The first speaker today is Dr. Tim Oosterbeek. Tim studied hydrology in Freiburg, Germany, and in Vancouver, Canada. He was employed between 2005 and 2012 in Germany at the Center for Environmental Systems Research in Kassel and at Heidelberg University, where he received his PhD. Here, his main research interests focused on integrated water resources management and hydrological impact modeling. Since 2012, Tim has been a senior researcher and consultant at the German IWW Water Centre in Mülheim an der Ruhr. His current research projects deal with pharmaceuticals in the aquatic environment, organic pollutants in Chinese and German surface waters, water resources management, and water quality issues in general. He has acquired multiple research grants from various national and international organizations such as EU Horizon 2020 and the United Nations Environment Program. He's also the author of 25 water-related publications, and we'll give you links to some of them during the webinar. Tim is our first speaker, and he will be followed by Anja Leetz, the Executive Director of Healthcare Without Harm Europe. Anja has worked for more than 10 years with such environmental and health organizations as Friends of the Earth and the European Environmental Bureau in the United Kingdom and in Belgium. Anja holds a teaching qualification, a BA in photography, and has recently obtained the qualifications of Foundation Manager at the European Business School in Germany. Anja will be speaking on policy and followed by Thomas Moller, who will be providing a case study from Aarhus University Hospital in Denmark, where he is the environmental coordinator. His area of work includes waste, wastewater, and the circular economy. Thomas Moller has been working for some years with hospital wastewater with a focus on both treatment, technology, and central municipal versus local or hospital treatment. Welcome to all of you and to our distinguished speakers. And with that, I will turn the ball over to Dr. Oosterbeek.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. This is Tim Oosterbeek from Germany, and today I will present some results of a study we conducted on pharmaceuticals in the environment, the global perspective, together with my colleagues Frank Andreas Weber and Axel Bergmann. So let me start just with the entry point. How do pharmaceuticals enter the environment? How do they get there before we can find them? So there are multiple sources. For example, the consumers, of course. When you consume pharmaceuticals, they will end up in wastewater, for example. The pharmaceutical industry is producing pharmaceuticals, of course, which you can also, for example, have discharge of those industrial complexes in surface waters. You have hospitals where many different kinds and amounts of pharmaceuticals are used, consumed. And then, of course, you have the agricultural sector and aquaculture sector where pharmaceuticals are being used. Then you can find those pharmaceuticals being consumed beforehand. You will find them later on, for example, in wastewater treatment plants, where they end up from the sewage system. Or, for example, you can find them in waste or wastewater in general, which is not routed through a wastewater treatment system. And then, of course, you can have them in sludge or manure, which are produced from animal dung, which have been beforehand given antibiotics, for example, or other pharmaceuticals. So then, in the end, we can find the pharmaceuticals, for example, in drinking water, where they end up, for example, by getting into the groundwater. Or if you use, for example, drinking water from surface waters, then you can also, for example, have the discharge of the wastewater treatment plants, which are not able to eliminate 100% of the pharmaceuticals found in the process. So in the end, the wastewater treatment plants discharge their water into surface waters, for example, lakes and rivers. And then, as I mentioned before, you can also have them or find pharmaceuticals in agricultural soils, and for example, by application of manure. Now, we conducted this study to learn a bit more about the global occurrence of pharmaceuticals in the environment, because there are many studies out there which, just look at one point and look at their local river systems or look at their local agricultural fields. But so far, for us, a concise global picture has been missing, especially as most studies are being conducted in developed countries. So in the end, we were interested in, is this really a global problem, or is this just a problem of developed countries? So together with our colleagues from a Delphi company in Germany, we conducted the study to learn a bit more. And what we did is we first set up a global database, a literature database, because we know that there are many, many different studies out there. And we just wanted to combine all those studies into one huge database where we can get all the data together into one environmental database. So first, what we did is to set up a literature database, and we gathered more than 1,000 publications where actual values, reported values of measured environmental concentrations of pharmaceuticals were reported. So in total, we found more than 1,000 plus 139 review articles. We found those publications by looking at different databases, for example, ISI, Web of Knowledge, library catalogs, but also, of course, the internet, where you, for example, can have reports rather than scientific publications. Then we also contacted stakeholders in countries where we didn't find much data. But also we used the data of existing projects, for example, the European projects like Norman, Knappe, Fates, which already gathered some data. So we didn't need to do the same work again. We just took all the data they had into our database. Most of the publications we found were English language scientific papers. There were relatively little governmental reports, but there were also reports in foreign languages such as Chinese, Russian, Slovenian, and so on. And here we got those reports and publications translated. So after gathering all those publications, and then we copied all the data from these publications into a big database. And what we found in the end were that we had this MEC database, measured environmental concentrations, and we found more than 120,000 database entries from these more than 1,000 publications. And here in this slide, you can see an overview of which environmental matrix, these concentrations were found. And as you can see on the lower left-hand side, you can see that most of the data points were measured in surface waters, groundwater, well water, drinking water, tap water. So this compartment is the largest, followed by sewage systems, which you can see in the upper left corner, with nearly 50,000 entries in the database. So that's, for example, wastewater treatment, effluents, influents, but also sewage from hospitals, for example. This is the case because usually in most studies what you will find is that people are measuring, or scientists are measuring, the inflow into the wastewater treatment plant. They want to see what kind of concentrations and loads are getting into the wastewater treatment plants of pharmaceuticals. Then how good are they, or how well are they eliminated within the wastewater treatment plant? So they measure at the effluent as well to see what's the elimination rate. And then what they also do is often to measure later on a few kilometers down the river, for example, where the wastewater was discharged into, so to see what the effects or the concentrations then in the rivers are. So that's why you find most of those entries here for surface water and wastewater. At the right-hand side, you can see more exotic, I would say, measurements, because they are not conducted very often. For example, in sediments, in suspended matter, but also, for example, in rain, in soil, manure, and so on. So now that we have this big database, we want to analyze it. We want to see which questions can we ask and answer with this database. So here are a few of those questions I want to present today. So on the global scale, where have pharmaceuticals been found in the environment? How many and what kind of pharmaceuticals have been found? Are the same pharmaceuticals detected in each UN regional group? So this UN regional groups, they are basically like continents. So we didn't use the continent scheme, we used the official United Nations scheme for that. What is the source of the pharmaceuticals found? At which concentrations are pharmaceuticals found in the environment? And lastly, can pharmaceuticals have ecotoxicological effects at these concentrations, which is of course also relevant. Now here are the first results. Here you can see that in about 31 countries, covering all 5 United Nations regional groups, pharmaceuticals have been detected. So that means that at least one pharmaceutical has been measured in the environment in these countries. And you can also see in these gray areas that not in all countries pharmaceuticals have been found or measured. So for example, here you can see in Africa that in many countries no data is available, but also, for example, in Central Asia, for example, Mongolia or Kazakhstan, there are not any data points. And here we need to say that in these countries also no measurements were conducted. So it's not that they have been measuring pharmaceuticals and didn't find any, but there were no measurements as well in these gray countries. Now if we look at the next map, here you can see the number of pharmaceuticals detected in surface water, groundwater, tap water, and or drinking water. And here you can see by the scale that there's a large variation between countries. For example, in Germany, Spain, the US, you will find more than 100 different pharmaceutical agents in the environment. And for example, in other countries, such as Russia, for example, you will find less pharmaceuticals. But please consider that this is not weighted. So this means there are many, many more measurements, for example, in those countries in red than those in yellow. So that means the more often you look for pharmaceuticals, you will also find them. And that's a pattern we noticed all over the world. So the relative detection rate is very similar. So here you can also see that in many countries only very little measurements have been conducted. Now that we come to the next slide, here you can see a similar map, now just focusing on drinking water and tap water. And here again, you can see that, for example, in Europe, US and China, that most of the pharmaceuticals have measured in those countries. And in most other countries, now you can see that no measurements have been conducted. Another result concerns the sewage and wastewater treatment plants. And here you can see that more data is now available, because as I showed earlier, that many studies are conducted also at wastewater treatment plants. And here you can see again similar patterns as we've seen before for surface water but also for drinking water, that we have a high number of pharmaceuticals being found in especially the developed countries. But this is also due to the fact that here many more data sets have been provided or have been analyzed. So how many pharmaceuticals have been found in the environment? In total, 713 pharmaceuticals have been analyzed, and of which 142 are transformation products, which means that they, for example, metabolites which are produced after you take, for example, a medication, pharmaceutical, then your body transforms this into different molecules, for example. Out of these 713, 631 have been found above the detection limits in the environment, of which 127 are transformation products. This means that most of the pharmaceuticals that were looked for have also been found in the environment. But this also means that we are only able currently to look for about 700 different pharmaceuticals. There are more than 2,500 pharmaceuticals out there. So this also means that we don't really know about the other pharmaceuticals, if they are occurring in the environment or not. Now, if we look at the different UN regions, at the different continents, so the question here is, are the same pharmaceuticals detected in each United Nations regional group? And what you can see here are the 5 continents, and you see different numbers. For example, we start with the blue one in the middle. This is the Western countries UN regional group, which means mainly Europe, North America, so more the industrialized countries. And here you can see, for example, that out of 646 pharmaceuticals being looked for, 574 have been found. So this is by far the largest group, which we've also seen on the map, that most of the measurements were conducted in these countries, in these regions. Now, if we look at the other groups, for example, in the upper left corner, you have the Eastern Europe group. Here we have a bit of a lower detection rate, so we have 126 out of 205 found. In Asia, in the upper right corner, Asia Pacific, we have 249 out of 313. In Africa, we have the lowest number, but that's what we've also seen on the map, that there are the lowest amount of data available, so about 40 out of 59. And then in Central and Latin America and Southern America, we have 55 out of 84. So here also the database is a bit smaller than, for example, in Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, and the Western countries. Another question we asked in the beginning, are the same pharmaceuticals detected in each UN regional groups? So in total, we found 16 pharmaceuticals in surface water, groundwater, drinking water, tap water in each of the 5 UN regional groups. And here's a table provided where you can see the name of the pharmaceuticals, a therapy group, and then the number of countries within each UN regional group where they have been found. And here you can see that diclofenac has been found in total in 50 countries worldwide. So this pharmaceutical agent is leading this group, followed by carbamazepine, ibuprofen, sulfamethoxazole, naproxen. So with different pharmaceuticals and especially different therapeutical groups. For example, we have medication for pain relief, such as diclofenac, but also anti-epileptics, antibiotics, estrogens, so that are hormones, lipid-lowering drugs. So we see a wide variety of pharmaceuticals being found globally in the environment in each UN regional group. The next question is, what kind of pharmaceuticals have been found in each UN group? And here you can see the different bars indicating which therapeutical group we're talking about. For example, in blue, you can see antibiotics. In green, analgesics, so for pain medication, for pain relief. Then in red, lipid-lowering drugs. In black, estrogen, hormones. And in gray, the other groups. And here you can see that there are different patterns throughout the world. So for example, that in Asia, for example, most detections focus on antibiotics, whereas, for example, in the Eastern Europe group, it's, for example, more analgesics. and in the African group, it's estrogens, for example. So this is partly due to the fact that, for example, different research groups focus on different topics. For example, in Africa, there's one big group focusing in South Africa on the detection of estrogens. So they provide lots of data because they conduct several studies. So that's why, for example, their estrogens make up more than 50% of their database entries for Africa. But also please note that there are different amounts of data behind those bars. For example, if you look at the Western Europe group, you have 96,000 entries, and in Africa you only have 1,000 database entries. So that means that this is not weighted. So we don't know what would happen if you would also have the same amount of measurements in each country or in each continent. The next question is, what is the source of pharmaceuticals found in the environment? Here you can see the gray pattern, that it's mostly unknown, because if you measure, for example, in surface water, you don't know where this is coming from. You measure something, but you can't be sure if this is coming from a wastewater treatment plant or from an agricultural field or from an industrial company. So that's why it's largely unknown. But what we can see is that urban areas are a major contributor, but also locally discharge from manufacturing, animal husbandry, and agriculture is important. And what we've seen is that we can also have effects of these concentrations found in the environment. For example, we've seen in several studies that ethanol estradiol, which is the agent used, the hormone used in the birth control pill, that this caused, for example, population collapse of fish due to feminization of the male fish in a big experiment in Canada at a lake. But also you've seen, for example, that fluoxetine, the antidepressant, had effects on tadpole development in frogs. So there are many, many studies by now out there showing that there are effects of these concentrations we found in the environment. And that's what we also look for in our maps. For example, we've seen that diclofenac is the most often found pharmaceuticals in about 50 countries. And then we looked at the threshold values. For example, there's a threshold value called predicted no effect concentration. And this is for diclofenac is 0.1 microgram per liter. You can say, okay, this threshold, this is relatively safe for the environment. Underneath, you can have effects. It doesn't mean that you must have effects, but and it also depends on if you have a long-term exposure or a short-term exposure. But there have been effects reported at PNEX at 0.1 microgram per liter. So and then if we look at our database, then we can see that there are many countries where already the average concentration is above this PNEC of 0.1 microgram per liter. For example, also in Germany, where you have 0.164 microgram per liters from more than 4,000 measurements. So this is relatively safe to say that this concentration is relevant. Whereas in other countries, for example, the Ukraine or Pakistan, you only have 8 measurements. So this is not has a high uncertainty as well. So there we rather need to be careful with the interpretation of those results. And we looked at ethanol estradiol, which I talked about earlier. Also, and here you have a really small PNEC, predicted no effect concentration of 0.0001 microgram per liter. And here are also in several countries where you can have higher concentrations than that. So what are the conclusions? We've just seen that pharmaceuticals occur globally in the environment. So not just only industrialized countries, which was our question in the beginning. And we've seen that we've detected pharmaceuticals in 71 countries covering all UN regional groups. The data availability for emerging and developing countries is increasing, but it's still lower than in Western countries. So that's what we've seen from those maps early on. In most countries, certain pharmaceuticals prevail at concentrations above the predicted no effect concentration in surface waters, suggesting adverse toxicological effects in these locations. Different pharmaceutical groups have been a focus of monitoring in different UN regions. For example, we've seen that antibiotics are mostly looked for in Asia, whereas it's estrogens in Africa. We've seen that urban wastewater discharge is the dominant emission pathway, while discharge from manufacturing, animal husbandry, and aquaculture are important regionally. And what I didn't show, but we looked also for consumption data to see if we can relate consumption data to findings in the environment. So what we can say here is that there's not enough data on consumption of different pharmaceuticals available for each country, so that we can, build a correlation between pharmaceutical use and detection in the environment. We also have a homepage of the project, pharmaceuticalsintheenvironment.org, where you can take a look at those maps and read a bit more about the whole process. And there's also a publication out, which appeared this year, Pharmaceuticals in the Environment, Global Occurrences and Perspective in Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, appeared earlier this year. And I want to thank our colleagues from the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Germany, for financing this project. And also would like to thank my colleagues, the German Federal Environment Agency, who are also heavily involved in this research project. The database itself and the full report will soon be available at www.uber.de, free of charge. And yeah, please contact me if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beek. What a fascinating and important body of research. We do have some questions coming in that we will save for later, but there's a couple clarifying questions that have come in before we move to the next presentation. What would you say is your top priority for further research based on the report you've just provided for us?
Yeah, currently one big topic is the mixture of different pharmaceuticals found in water samples, for example, because we know as I've shown, for specific pharmaceuticals, we know what kind of effects they have and at which concentrations these pharmaceuticals have effects. But we don't know much about the combination. For example, in some water samples, you can find up to 40 different pharmaceuticals. But we don't really know what the interaction and the combined effects are. So I think this is currently a big topic in research. Thank you.
And a reminder to everyone that as you have questions, please write them in the chat box or in the Q&A box at the top of your screen, and we'll address them at the end of the next two speakers. Do you have concentrations for the 16 pharmaceuticals measured in the 5 UN regions?
Yes, of course. The whole database is based on MEX, which means measured environmental concentrations. So this is a huge amount of data of concentrations. And for example, I've conducted a bit more, or I've added some more data to this from another study, and what we found now is also published in the publication, which I just mentioned earlier. And I'm going back, and there is a table in there, and there you can see all the average and maximum concentrations for those 16 different pharmaceuticals for the different UN regional groups.
Thank you. The last question for you before we move on is that on slide 17, and I can move this, you showed that the proportion of pharmaceuticals in the environment coming from hospital wastewater is the red, which looks very low. Do you think that that's an accurate proportion, or is the unknown raising that in relation to others?
Yeah. This is of course a problem, because this is only when in a study it is reported that it was measured at a hospital. So later on, if the same hospital wastewater ends up in a wastewater treatment plant, or it ends up in surface water, for example, then it's not labeled as hospital wastewater anymore, because then, for example, it's urban water or or sewage water, for example. So this makes it then very difficult to distinguish between hospital wastewater and other water. So these red dots here, or these red bars, are just data that are actually being measured directly at the hospital.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to thank you again and call on Anja Leetz as we move to the subject of pharmaceutical pollution, healthcare action, and policy processes. As you've noticed, we're going to go from the science to policy, and then our last speaker, Thomas Moller, will be talking about a case study from his work in a hospital in Denmark. Anja, welcome. I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much, Susan, and welcome everybody, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So I will be looking at the work Healthcare Without Harm is doing and also at the process. So I will look at our goals in our work, talk a bit about the active pharmaceutical characteristics, current evidence and reports, and the global policy process as well as the European one, and that what we do in as Healthcare Without Harm Europe, plus finally the potential for action and collaboration. So for those of us who don't know Healthcare Without Harm is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, and we have 4 regional offices in the US, Europe, Latin America, and Asia. And we have also partners in China, India, Australia, and Africa. Our work is based on the assumption that every person should have a right to environmental health and access to healthcare, and that we need to ensure that people can live in a healthy environment to stay healthy, but once they do fall ill, they should have access to healthcare and treatment. Healthcare Without Harm's vision for healthcare is that it mobilizes its ethical, economic, and political influence to create an ecological, sustainable, and equitable and healthy world. Our mission is that we transform the healthcare worldwide so that it reduces its environmental footprint, becomes a community anchor for sustainability, and a leader in the global movement for environmental health and justice. Healthcare Without Harm's goal on pharmaceutical is that we support the safe production, management, and disposal of pharmaceuticals, reducing their environmental and health impact throughout the entire life cycle, and fostering innovation for green products. I wanted to make sure that we understand some basic issues about active pharmaceutical ingredients, and that is basically stating that they are designed to be highly biological active at very low concentrations, because that's how you use them to treat patients or animals. And thus, because of their inherent value, they can be released into the environment at every stage of the life cycle. So that is production, use, and disposal. So they are released during manufacturing processes. Most of them produced are in China and India. There has been recently a report looking at the impact of those on the environment during production. And then also once they're in use for both human as well as animal use, they can pass through the body unchanged. So then the metabolites may be still biologically active, and research has found that between 30 and 90% of an oral dose can be excreted in the urine. The APIs that are then released into the environment from wastewater and sewage sludge that Tim also alluded on. And in addition, we also find inappropriate disposal of unused medicines, where people just simply don't know how to get rid of pharmaceuticals in a safe way. So what is current evidence? That's a report that Tim has just been speaking about that will soon be available at the UBA website, and that is really looking at that more than 600 pharmaceuticals and their metabolites have been found in the environment in 71 countries and on all continents. And I think that's very important research, and also to stress in our policy discussion. And another report that came out recently from the UK, from the review on antimicrobial resistance, and that is actually predicting that over the next 35 years, we will have 30 million premature deaths that will be occurring. And this is a real challenge that we're facing currently, is if we continue using antibiotics as with the way we do, and we don't find any new drugs, then we're creating a problem. So we soon come to the age or the time what it was before we had antibiotics available. I just wanted to briefly bring up some research that has been found and looked at on the contamination of drinking water. And there are many studies conducted on this, and the WHO has found up to 25 different pharmaceuticals and metabolites in drinking water around the world. There were a number of studies done in Germany that have found lipid-lowering and analgesic drugs found in drinking water in Germany, as well as studies in Italy and the Netherlands. And here it's more an ethical issue, is that what type of water we're providing to citizens as well as, for animals. Do we want to drink contaminated drinking water? And then we also have to know it's not just pharmaceuticals, but it's also biocides, it's pesticides and industrial chemicals. So we're actually drinking a cocktail, and currently the wastewater treatment plants are not able to filter everything out. So I think there as a society we have to ask ourselves is what can we do to keep our water clean, because we're really depending on water. Here are a number of reports that have come out recently. We're looking at various issues. For instance, the biointelligence report that came out in 2013. It's for the European policy context, as well as a report for the German Environment Agency and the Royal Society of the UK, etc. And so I just wanted to give you those links later so you can look at them and follow them up. But there has been recently a body of work being produced really looking at the different issues. And interestingly, also from the practical perspective, there has been a number of EU-funded projects that look at the impact of pharmaceuticals in the healthcare sector, and also ways how to reduce it. And one I wanted to specifically point out is that European No Pills project, where you find all the data, and it's been looking at different ways of addressing it, dealing with hospital sewage, or also working with patients that you collect the urine 24 hours after treatment. I wanted to talk a little bit about the global process, because obviously in the scientific world it's been known for quite a while that there is pharmaceutical pollution, and there is a UN process that is called SICAM, that is a strategic approach to international chemicals management that has been set up in 2006. It's a voluntary process where 196 countries are coming together and discussing how they can control chemicals at a global level. And the goal that was set up was in 2006 is that they said by 2020 chemicals should be produced and used in ways that minimize significant adverse impacts on the environment and human health. And we are now 4 years away from 2020, and we have to assess that, and we basically have to say that that goal will not be achieved. But having said that, since 2006, there have been regular meetings, there has been research work conducted, there have been pilot projects being conducted at different UN regions, and there is an attempt to address chemical pollution. SICAM also has a specific healthcare strategy, again looking at how can chemicals be reduced in the healthcare sector. And in addition, also, they have a policy process that they can agree on emerging policy issues. So new issues can be brought onto the table, can be discussed by the global community. And as such, pharmaceuticals have been discussed over the last few years. And finally, last year in the autumn in Geneva in 2015, the global community agreed that environmentally persistent pharmaceutical pollutants are an emerging issue. among other issues such as nanomaterials, endocrine disrupting chemicals, highly persistent pesticides, lead in paint, and others. So what does this mean? So the global community has come together and has agreed this is an emerging issue. That means that the global community also will give some focus on attention on how to address this. So this is a really good opportunity for all of us around the world to go to our respective countries and saying, what are you doing to reduce the pharmaceutical pollution? What kind of measurements are you taking to observe and finding the, actually creating the base for any action? And also what effort are you putting in, and what can you report in 2020? Because in 2020, there will be the next international conference on chemicals management, and then different countries have to report. There will also have to be some work on pharmaceuticals. So for all of you, I would encourage you to go to your countries and actually demand some action, because, as I said, 196 countries agreed on this last fall. I wanted to look a little bit at how it works in Europe, because before a product can be put on the European market, it has to go through an authorization process. So with this, the applicant or the company will have to provide some data, and they have to give an indication of any potential risk presented by a pharmaceutical product in the environment. And also they have to give specific arrangements to limit the environmental impact. But at the same time also, we have another directive in Europe that says, in any event, even if there is an impact, that should not be constitute as a criteria for refusal of a marketing authorization. So what this means in practice is that even though we may have an impact in the environment and there may be a risk, it will not restrict for any human medicine to come onto the market. So this basically means that we have to really look at how do we extend the scope of the environmental risk assessment, and then what do we actually do with that knowledge and to reduce the risk once the product is on the market. Then we have another directive that's looking at the unused medicine, because of course that's something that's the other end. One is the authorization, and then the other one is one where you have unused out-of-date medicine. And here in that directive, it's basically saying it introduces an obligation for all countries to implement appropriate collection schemes for unused pharmaceutical products. So that means all the 28 countries in Europe that are part of the European Union have to introduce a collection scheme. Unfortunately, it doesn't provide any guidelines on how you implement the schemes, and we have looked at a number of studies that pointed to significant differences between member states. Healthcare Without Time Europe conducted its own report, and we could even see the number of countries where we're not even sure that there is a collection scheme. What it basically means is you have a highly scattered and a deficient system, and it also means that it prevents comparison between the countries and the different types of schemes. And we are not sure to what extent it would amount in the end compared to the pharmaceuticals that are available on the market are actually being collected. I just wanted to highlight a case that we had a few years ago. And Healthcare Without Time Europe is focusing a lot on policy at European level, because then it will have an impact on all the 28 countries. And what happened in 2013, we have a Water Framework Directive, and the Water Framework Directive is really looking at reducing harmful substances. And in 2013, there was an analysis done of 2,000 substances that are harmful to the aquatic ecosystems. And in that 2,000 substances, 24 of them were pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, none of them made it onto the list. What we have achieved now, for the first time, we have 3 pharmaceuticals on a watch list. Beek, that also Tim mentioned, was highly measured and there in the environment, and 2 estrogen chemicals used in the contraceptive pill. So what it means having those 3 pharmaceuticals on that list, it means that all 28 countries are obliged to measure it, because it's only when you have measurements and data we can take the next action, and that is actually taking steps to control it. Another case I wanted to highlight is the difference, or the gap, I call it, between science and practical implementation. As you probably are well aware, in India there has been a case that between 1992 and 2007, almost the whole vulture population died, and it was diclofenac was identified as the reason for that, because it was used for as painkiller for treatment for cows. As a result, diclofenac was banned for veterinary use, and they were encouraged to switch to meloxicam, and then a really expensive breeding program was introduced to get the vulture population up again. So having that scientific knowledge and that case study in India still having prevented Spain and Italy to authorize the use of diclofenac for veterinary use. And if you know that 99% of the European vulture population lives in Spain, one cannot understand a political decision as such. And so we have to see what will happen to the vulture population in Spain. Another thing I would like to highlight to you is a Swedish case study. You may have come across it. So what happens is that Sweden at some point went to the industry and said, we would like to evaluate the substances that are on the Swedish market, and because we've been taking measurements in the Stockholm water system, and we want to really evaluate how we can reduce the occurrence of pharmaceuticals in the environment. So what they have now developed over many years is requiring data from the industry and then do an evaluation. So what is the impact of how many substances they have with degradation data, and what has been shown that 90% of the data they have is very slow and degrading and potentially persistent. And the same as when you look at the toxicity data, they can say that 55% have high or very high toxicity of the products that are available on the Swedish market. What they have basically saying is the problem is with their database is they have only 50% of data. That means you cannot really make a very good analysis, and at the moment they're still assuming that if they don't have data, it's not considered a risk for the environment. But with the data they are having, they have created a WISE list that has been available for procurers as well as doctors every year. It's a voluntary scheme, and they have been training the doctors and to say if they are prescribing a drug and they see drugs that have similar effect on a patient, they can go through the WISE list and can see which one is less harmful to the environment and can prescribe accordingly. It's important to point out that this is a voluntary scheme, and it just provides another source of information for a doctor to make a decision, while the first case is to find the best suitable drug for a patient. But that is one way of, Swedish way of addressing the issue of pharmaceutical pollution. So what is Healthcare Without Harm Europe doing? Like I said, we're very involved in the policy process in Europe, and we thought it is very important from our work and research. It was noticeable that not a lot of people know about pharmaceutical pollution. So we created a Pharma resource center. You can see the website here. And the objective of this resource center is really to keep track of scientific articles, reports, and books that has been published on pharmaceuticals and the environment. We basically put those documents up where they're publicly available, or we give links where they can be bought and downloaded from. And then we give them keywords and search words, so you can find a number of reports, and we keep that updated on our website. We have done a number of publications. So one was done by our colleagues in the US. It's really looking at the research priorities to address pharmaceuticals and the environment. We've done a snapshot report for the European case where we looked at where unused pharmaceuticals are ending up. We did actually an interview program with citizens in a number of EU capitals, to see how well is the awareness of the general public on how to deal with unused pharmaceuticals. And as we expected, there's very low awareness, and we think there needs to be far more done so that every person knows how to get rid of unused pharmaceuticals in a safe way. And we also identified that the different schemes and the variations, and also that some countries do not appear to take action on collecting unused pharmaceuticals. And we created a Pharma leaflet on how doctors can help to reduce pharmaceutical pollution, where again we will bring the scientific evidence and then easy steps. This pharmaceutical leaflet is available in 4 languages, and more languages coming up as it's been used by doctors or health associations in different countries. So what do we think should be done by different actors? Like I said earlier on, we're having the exposure at all levels through the whole life cycle, so therefore different stakeholders have to take different actions. And here's what we think that the industry should be doing during production, and that is really to end local pollution and clean up the production sites. We believe that the industry should take full responsibility of their supply chain, because they know their supply chain, and they should fully integrate environmental management into daily business. The national health system, together with the industry, has developed guidelines on reducing carbon, and these guidelines are publicly available, and we think that all industry should apply this guideline to reduce carbon during production, and it's also a money saver for those companies. It's very important for us as an NGO that the industry is transparent on environmental reporting and includes third-party evaluation. And finally, the most important point is that we need to have R&D with a goal to develop pharmaceuticals that are benign by design. This will be a long-term process, but if we don't start it now, we will not have different types of pharmaceuticals in 20 years' time. So what can the health sector do? We really support the WHO basis of rational use of pharmaceuticals, or prescribing pharmaceuticals when they are needed. It's important to train and educate the healthcare sector about the impact of pharmaceuticals in the environment. We believe it's necessary to train them in their training process, but even once they're active and working, they should know about that impact. And there has also been some interesting work done recently in the UK that is looking at different options for treatment. So for instance, if you suffer from depression, it may not be always the best way to prescribe drugs, but using other ways of treatment like counseling or group work or being out gardening. So there have been projects that are really looking at what other ways. It may not be for all treatments, but it's important to explore different options. One way we think it would be useful is to evaluate the WISE list from Sweden and other projects like the EU NOPL project that look at the connection between treatment and the impact on the environment, and through the evaluation of the various projects to really tease out what would be the best and most successful way forward on reducing the impact. But what we've also seen is that there is the diffuse entry into the environment. So we have to see and evaluate whether it would be good to looking at hospital waste, or if not, most is actually coming out of the household waste when patients are at home. We also think it's important that we educate the patients about the impact of pharmaceuticals in the environment, so patients are really only taking drugs when they're needed. And then, of course, for us, it's the low-hanging fruit is the collection of unused medicine and the proper collection. And here, I think it's important that it's the same like we have now in Europe, that everybody knows where and how to recycle batteries, and it should be just as normal to know how to recycle unused pharmaceuticals. And finally, I wanted to look at what is the action needed by policymakers. And here, it's really important that we have measurements, that we have good data. And like Tim alluded, we don't have data for the same amount of data for all UN regions, and different pharmaceuticals have been detected depending on what they looked for. So we believe as the more you look for, you will also find more, and it's only then that you have a good basis for decision making. And then, of course, it's the role of the policymaker to legislate and to protect humans and the environment. In Europe, we have the precautionary principle enshrined in EU lawmaking, and I think that should be applied also globally, because in the end, we don't know yet what will be the long-term impact of pharmaceuticals on the environment. And while, as for now, the scientific consensus is that those concentrations found in drinking water or food or whatever will have no impact, we don't know how science will develop or what new data we will have. And like I said earlier, we need to discuss as a global community what are we prepared to pay to avoid being exposed to pharmaceutical pollution. And here it's a long-term exposure, it's a cocktail effect, and also to say that because we have global pollution, we have no control group, and there is this uncertainty in science. So as a conclusion, with the way currently APIs are designed, we cannot avoid pharmaceutical pollution. All we can do is minimize them at every stage. This is a global problem that also needs global action. It's important to educate, to monitor, and to legislate and act at all levels. And a long-term strategy is we need to develop green pharmaceuticals. It's important to involve and engage the different stakeholders, and the healthcare sector is one of them, and we need joint action. And we need to share our learnings. So here I've just put my email contact as well as our website. And finally, one way of sharing would be at our next CleanMed that is happening in the autumn. We'll be having a conference in Copenhagen where we also feature good case studies from work that has been done in pharmaceuticals. Corporate proposals are still open, so if you think you have a good case study, how are you addressing it at your hospital or your region, we would love to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anja Leetz, for this rousing call to action for all of us to be involved in pharmaceutical policy, and especially for the leadership of Healthcare Without Harm Europe in this area. A reminder that if you have questions for any of the speakers, please put them in the chat box. We'll have time at the end to address those questions. And I would now like to turn the ball and the microphone over to Thomas Moller, our third and final speaker.
Hello, thank you, Susan.
You're loud and clear. Go right ahead. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. I just wanted to find my slides there. Good, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the environmental impact and treatment and mapping of toxin medicine in hospital wastewater, in specific about our experiences at the AUH in Aarhus. AUH is the Aarhus University Hospital. See how I do this. Good. For me, there are two issues on the agenda. First, I'm going to talk a bit about the treatment possibilities that we have in Denmark. It is the case in Denmark is so that the Danish legislations dictate that when there's a technology available for treatment of the wastewater, we have to establish that treatment locally at the hospital. So that's a challenge right now, actually, that we have to address this problem since there is already technology available in the market. So that's the first part of my agenda here. And secondly, I'm going to talk a bit about results from mapping of pharmaceuticals in the wastewater from AUH, which is extremely exciting, actually. It provided new knowledge for me and the people I'm working with on this subject. So moving on a bit here. These are the technologies that we are looking at and working with in Denmark. A more regular MBR technology for a moving biofilm reactor, and a new MBBR technology that we are working with a number of companies on a pilot scale project. The major difference between these two technologies is actually the wheel that this plastic wheel you see in the upper left corner of my slide here, it's about 1 inch in diameter, and this plastic wheel contains a growing biofilm that actually is relatively thick compared to what is in the moving biofilm reactor in a more conventional treatment plant. And this provides the possibility of a more diverse consumption of the bacteria and the farmers in the wastewater, and that's what we're hoping to see the benefits from when we are entering the project. The project is still on the way, but we're hoping to see that this technology, the MBBR technology, will actually solve the same problem cheaper than a more conventional MBR technology. For now, the MBR technology is provided by Grundfos and the BioBooster in Denmark, and it's actually up and running in full scale at Herlev Hospital, and it's working quite well. So, in that sense, there is a technology available, and that's why we have to address this problem as hospitals in Denmark. So, but at the AUH, we saw a possibility in this MBBR technology that is interesting, because we think that it might do the same job just as good, well, and cheaper. So that's what we're working on. And these are the project participants in the MERMIS project, where MERMIS is a Danish short for the title on this presentation, the environmental effective treatment of pharmaceuticals in wastewater. That doesn't make sense if you look at it there, but this is the Danish short, so that's how this word came up. And these logos just represent the technology providers, us as a hospital, consultants, water companies, and universities that all participate in this project, developing this MBBR technology. Just quick and short, the MBBR technology, the way it's functioning is that it consists of a number of reactors with this biofilm growing on these plastic wheels, and the specific thing and the special thing compared to normal bioreactors is that the biomass in the first reactor is consumed easily, and that's compared to what happens in a normal moving bioreactor, a more conventional treatment plant. What is different here is that when all the easy degradable compounds in the wastewater is digested, if you like that word, what is left for the next reactor is not as easily digestible, and that means that the bacteria in this reactor have to specialize in degrading more difficult degradable substances, and that means that the nature, the bacteria in these reactors actually help us degrade the compounds way more effective than in normal or more traditional treatment plants. It can, of course, it can't clean it, not within what's the word for that? Within a normal budget of it's not possible for these bacteria to degrade all the compounds in the wastewater. So we do, of course, have to oxidize with ozone after the biological step in the treatment plant. And that's one of the big issues here, how much ozone or how much can we actually save on ozone when the biofilm is working optional. The plant has been tested at the AUH in 2015 over a period of 9 months, and and unfortunately we haven't got the final results from this yet. It's actually only been a couple of months since it's been moved to Hanningven, which is a municipal wastewater treatment plant, and it's just been implemented there as a pilot scale treatment plant where the scope is to treat already treated wastewater. So this is actually a post-treatment application for the municipal wastewater there, and the scope is of course to figure out where do we get the most out of our money, where is the biggest environmental effect from cleaning the wastewater. Is it at the municipal wastewater treatment plant, or is it locally at the local hospital? The results so far have shown that we were right. It does seem to be quite more effective, the MBBR technology compared with an MBR technology, and this does of course mean that if you can lower the content of the organic compounds in bio-treated wastewater, it will lower the ozonation costs and therefore result in a cheaper treatment, and that is of course most interesting. And also the nitrogen and phosphorus removal is quite significant compared to an MBR technology, which is of course relevant if the water is discharged right directly to a recipient. That is at least the case in Denmark. I'm not sure how that will work or how the scenarios in different and other countries, but for Denmark this is scenario and it's quite relevant. So that might save money in the long run if we discharge directly to the recipient. But for right now, we're not done with the project, and we'll be wiser in 2017 when the test period in Hannings is over too. That will give us the input about mapping the removal of the pharmaceuticals. Treatment cost will be clear by then, and that will give us the possibility to benchmark between local treatment at the hospital and centrally at the municipal wastewater treatment plant. So we are of course we're looking forward to that. It's quite exciting, also because it's actually challenging the way the legislation is in Denmark. Today it's dictated that the wastewater should be treated for the pharmaceuticals directly at the hospital, but we want to challenge that opinion, that the legislation, and we're questioning whether it could be done more wisely at the municipal wastewater treatment plant. So that's the scope with this. Yes, that's one part of my presentation. Next part is focusing on mapping the pharmaceuticals in the wastewater, and that's what while we're waiting on the results from the MERMES project. One of the main issues that we've tried to communicate from the project group in Denmark is that the number of ambulant treatments is rising dramatically. I've taken a few numbers from AUH from the period 2007 to 2014, and there's actually a rise in the ambulant treatments of 31% in that relatively short period of time. And that does, of course, mean that medicine is discharged to a large extent from the patient's own homes, meaning that treating the wastewater locally at the hospital doesn't make sense, because we won't remove pharmas that are discharged in people's own homes when we treat the wastewater at the hospital. And that is actually a crucial point, since this is it's relatively expensive to remove and treat wastewater for pharmaceuticals. So mapping this environmental benefit is highly relevant, and that's actually why we decided to do that alongside the pilot project with the MBBR technology. This mapping is based on a number of consumptions lined up here. We're only looking at pharmaceuticals exceeding 2% of the national consumption, meaning that pharmaceuticals used on hospitals in very small amounts are not relevant. Furthermore, we based the mapping on a Danish list containing 36 pharmaceuticals, and that list is actually expanding as we get more knowledge about PNEX and other relevant data on the single pharmaceutical. So this list is actually moving, but in 2014, the data for 2014 are based on these 36 pharmaceuticals in this mapping that I'm talking about here today. And of course, the toxicity in nature is based on the PNEC values. And then there's some preconditions that all consumed medicine is disposed directly into the toilet or sewer, meaning that this is actually the most conservative way to look at it. But it also means that metabolization is not in consideration here, the cocktail effect between different pharmas, what happens if they react in the sewer or in the environment. Do we get some even more harmful drugs out of that? That is not in consideration, and half-life of the pharmaceuticals are not in consideration either. So the mapping of discharge from AUH is based on numbers from the electronic patient journal, and then quality assured with data from our pharmacy at the AUH2. And what makes this significant is that in the Danish health sector, we register all donations to patients with a number of different data, and one of these data is that we register whether the patient is hospitalized or it's an ambulant treatment. And this does actually make it possible to divide the impact on nature in primary sector, meaning the people's own homes, and secondary sector, meaning the hospital. And this is quite important, since the impact from the ambulant treatments will be rising, since the number of ambulant treatment is rising dramatically, and that is giving us some new insights in the relevance regarding the placement of the treatment plan. But overall, what we can see is that especially 6 drugs implies great environmental impact, and these are the 6 drugs I've listed here in below. So it does indicate that some drugs are much more important to look at than others. And then some of the calculated environmental impact. This number, I'll try to explain how I reached this number. This is a summed PNEC. I figured that would be the most, the easiest way to picture how significant the environmental impact is for a certain number of drugs. So this number for 2011, the 12,828, is the summed value of all the 36 drugs meaning that, for instance, if one of those drugs had a PNEC value of 100, meaning that it was exceeding the PNEC concentration with 100, that's 100 of those 12,500. So the rest of the drugs will sum up with this drug, meaning that this is the total environmental impact with a single number. I hope this makes sense to you. But what we've seen is that it's rising quite significant from 2011 to 2014. And what is actually more significant is that we're seeing a decrease in environmental impact from the secondary sector, the hospitals, also as some PNEC in the same period. This means that, and that's what I'm showing you on the next slide, that the relatively impact from the primary sector is actually rising. And as you can see, these numbers were quite surprising to us. Of the 36 drugs that we're looking at, these 36 drugs are 36 drugs out of about 1,000 that we're using at the hospital. Of those few drugs, almost well, way above 90% of the environmental impact comes from the ambulance treatments, meaning that if we were to treat the wastewater locally at the hospital, we wouldn't get much out of it. The effect would maybe wouldn't even be there. It is, though, very important to mention that if you could or take out some of the drugs on the list I showed you before, especially the one, the mycophenol acid, if we take that out of our mapping, the environmental impact from the ambulant treatment will decrease dramatically, and that does in fact also call for a more common list of what pharmaceuticals we actually want to look at and we actually want to address when we treat this wastewater. As I've experienced, the list that we're looking at in Denmark is very different from what we're looking at in Germany and Sweden and Switzerland and other countries. So in my opinion, there's actually an urgent need for a more common international list on what pharmaceuticals do we look at, because it has a great impact on the picture of what impact, environmental impact, our discharge of farmers into the nature have. What kind of drugs we have on the list we're looking at. So that's quite important. All right. And then some conclusions on the local scenario in Aarhus. Since it's obvious that the environmental impact from the ambulant treatments to a very large extent comes from the ambulant treatment, it's very important that we think about. There's a risk that the environmental effect of the local treatment will simply fail to materialize if we still focus on local treatment instead of treatment on the municipal wastewater treatment plant. And again, this is relatively expensive, so we have to be sure when we establish these treatment plants that we establish them in the right place. And then there's the need for mapping of distribution of an environmental impact between primary and secondary sector. I think this mapping that we've done at AUH shows that the picture is not so clear whether it should be local or it should be centrally at the municipal wastewater plant. We need more mapping to be certain whether we should place this treatment at the hospital or at the municipal wastewater treatment plant. And of course, the treatment plant, the treatment of the wastewater will be more expensive if we place it at the municipal wastewater treatment plant, since the volume of wastewater there is significantly higher than it will be on the hospitals. But there are benefits and quite significant benefits by treating the wastewater at the treatment of the municipal treatment plant. We will address, for instance, the MRSA. Resistant bacteria that is a rising bomb under the global health, actually, and we will have the ability to address microplastics and all pharmas as a side effect from the primary sector will be addressed and be removed. So the treated wastewater from the municipal wastewater treatment plant will be so much more clean and so much less harmful for nature when it's discharged. And this should, of course, in my opinion, be taken into consideration, no matter where we decide to treat it. Yes, and that's basically the conclusion for now. When we reach the beginning of 2017, we will of course be wiser on the conclusions from the MERMIS project, the pilot plant project, and whether it's cheaper or more expensive to treat it locally or centrally.
There's a number of questions that have come in for the speakers, and I will direct them to the speakers as they came in. The question is for Tim. Tim, based on your research, what do you think are the top priorities for action to address pharmaceutical pollution? And the questioner suggests, is it manufacturing waste, veterinary use, excretion, or treatment needs?
Mm. Yeah, that's a very good question. We've seen in our study, and what I've also shown, is that the main contributor are urban areas. So we need to look at different priorities at different sources. For example, in urban areas, what has been done now in some areas or some countries, for example, like Switzerland, is to upgrade their wastewater treatment plants, their municipal ones. For example, with ozonation, active carbon, and so on. So that way you will be able to reduce the pollution load of pharmaceuticals getting into the environment from those sources. But then, of course, also when you look at the other sources, for example, if you look at agriculture, there it's important to use less, for example, antibiotics, which are in some cases just generally given as a feed additive because you have large herds. And so at this point, it might be wiser, for example, to change your agricultural management system, and thus you may need less antibiotics. And lastly, for example, if you look at industrial production, there it makes sense, for example, to go to the main producers, which are, for example, in India, Pakistan, for example, and to look at the concentrations there, because there we can find really high concentrations. So that's higher than, for example, in European or American countries. So that's one point where you can, directly go to those countries and measure there, and also invent there if possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas, you talked about the need for mapping, and as your slides demonstrated, it calls for municipal treatment over individual hospital treatment. Looking at your mapping, the question is, what technology or expertise is needed for mapping? If hospitals that are on this call or countries that have not done this work want to begin?
That's a good question, actually. What kind of expertise? I think the key issue here is to divide the environmental impact from the primary sector from the secondary sector, and the ability to do that might not be there in other countries. I'm not aware of how the health sector is working, but it's quite unique that we in Denmark have the data that show us how much medicine is distributed through ambulant treated patients and how much through hospitalized patients. So it's more of a data issue that is important here. That we map how we consume the medicine and where we consume it, because if we don't know where we consume it and discharge it, it's very difficult to address the problem in the right place. So that's actually my what's that word?
So it sounds more like it's a survey than it is a particular scientific analysis.
Pardon? Could you say that again?
It sounds, therefore, that it's more a survey than a scientific analysis.
Yeah, you could say that. This is what I've done. It's more or less just a survey. It's a data withdrawal from a database that I've analyzed. I haven't done any scientific work on the specific drugs, on how they react in wastewater and environment. So it's more like a survey. Yeah.
Thank you. And last question for Anja. Does Healthcare Without Harm Europe have recommendations for what countries in Europe should be doing with their unused and expired medications?
Yeah, I think what we recommend is, first of all, is to do a proper information scheme so that citizens are aware that there is an issue with pharmaceuticals in the environment and that they know how to get rid of unused pharmaceuticals in an easy way, because you need to make it easy and accessible so that citizens actually take that route. So there is an obligation by countries to do that. It's also important that countries actually compare and analyze the impact, and that's currently not done. So we don't even know. It's hard to compare because it's different schemes being used across the countries in Europe. But in the end, we think the collection of unused pharmaceuticals is the easiest low-hanging fruit. So this should be a no-brainer and should be done in every country. And there's these other issues that I spoke earlier in terms of production and also use that need to be addressed. And I said there are different projects going on looking at what would be the best impact. And for everything, you need to have that data. So countries need to invest in measurements, and in order to have that data and looking what is sold and where and how much is being used, and then also doing the testing so that we have a good database for decision making. And so some of those EU projects that have been looking at different options of how to control it during the use phase may give us a good indication about further steps. And just to finalize to say is, there is an obligation by the European Commission to come forward with a proposal on how to reduce pharmaceuticals in the environment, because it has been recognized as a problem. The question is just what steps are they proposing and what would be having the highest impact. So this is very much open for debate now, so we're going to enter a whole debate at European level, which will take us over the next 4 to 5 years. But hopefully at that point we have some concrete actions and outcomes. But as I said, it's not good enough just to do it in Europe, because it's a global issue. So while we can take the first steps in Europe, I think it's really important to have that awareness. It's a global issue and it has to be addressed globally at all different levels, and we have to challenge everybody, be it the industry or be it the patients or the doctors, you know, as well as the water treatment plants, and we all, how we're using it in agriculture. So we all have to take steps, otherwise we will not address this adequately. The matter is just what would be the priorities and what is the biggest winner, and that's why we need that data. Thank you.
There's a number of questions for you, Thomas, related to the 6 pharmaceuticals that were prioritized. The first is, what were the 6 drugs with 98.2% of the total impacts to the environment?
Yes. Here they are. at the bottom of the slide here, the mycophenol acid, clarithromycin, ceftazidime, sulfamethoxazole, ciprofloxacin, cepacitabine.
And as you're, great, thank you. And as you have been recommending that we need to develop a common list of the pharmaceutical agents to avoid discharge, how would you prioritize the creation of a common list?
Oh, that's a good question. That would actually depend on more mapping. I would have to say that, because mapping in Aarhus shows one thing. It might not be very different in the United States or in China or in Italy or in Russia or someplace else, but we have to map whether the picture we have in Aarhus is the same that we'll see other places in the world. Because making a list on Danish data will not necessarily show the right picture for the rest of the globe. So that's very difficult to give a straight answer on that right now, I think. But more mapping and then a dialogue on the results of those mapping.
Tim, would you like to add to that? What is your thinking about how to prioritize those agents that should be addressed? Do you think it's possible to create a common list?
It's quite difficult. I completely agree with Thomas, but we've seen that for example, in the database, we have seen that they use, for example, in China, they use different antibiotics, for example, as we usually look for or find in Germany or in most European countries. So if you would develop such a priority list, for example, for antibiotics, and then would transfer them to China, and then you could have some problems, for example. It's difficult, but I think it's important to start, for example, with the consumption. If you know which pharmaceutical has been consumed at which level, which amount, and then to combine this with the potential ecotoxicological effects. So which pharmaceuticals are the most harmful ones for the environment, and then you can try to set up such a list. But I know that many different regions try to do that, but it's not as straightforward because it's not as comparable as it could be. Thank you.
Thank you. And another question for you, Thomas, that has come in. You were talking about how expensive the wastewater treatment is. Can you tell us what the cost is per liter?
I can tell you what the cost is for the full-scale plant in Halle right now. As I recall it, it's about €1 per cubic meters, maybe a little more, a little less. And unfortunately, we do not have numbers for the MBBR technology yet, but we expect them to be below that. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to work with it. I haven't got a final number that I can tell you yet. So we'll have to wait to the beginning of 2017 before I'm able to give you a number for the MBBR technology. But for the MBR technology that is running full scale, it's about €1 per cubic meter.
Thank you. Another question for you. I noticed the use of persistent bioaccumulative and LC50-based toxicity in the Swedish environmental medicine list can lead to erroneous conclusions, such as that fluoxetine has low or no ecotoxicity impact. The literature shows this is not the case. The issue is that acute lethality, even chronic lethality, is sometimes too crude a measurement for environmental impact. That said, the fact that Sweden put this list together in the first place is a leading example for the rest of us. I guess it's more a comment than a question, but do you have anything to add, Tim or Thomas?
No, it does sound interesting, but I don't have any comments right now, at least.
Me neither.
Okay. Here's a question for myself. The pharmaceutical industry continuously claims that current levels in the environment and in drinking water in particular are not dangerous to humans. But I read in studies that there's a lot we actually don't know regarding long-term effects and cumulative effects. Can you comment on that? The work that the pharmaceutical industry is quoting is from the WHO report in 2012, which, as I mentioned and cited in the presentation, did not include any of the data that you've heard from the two presenters today. So the level of research has really progressed in terms of its impact on patients and whether the active ingredient is at a level of that has an impact on humans. There has not been any controlled trials to demonstrate or to debunk that result. And with the difficulties we are currently suffering under with antimicrobial resistance and extremely antimicrobial resistant antibiotics, that any antibiotic in a wastewater stream that could be ingested and therefore contribute to continuing antimicrobial resistance must be prevented. Another question came in for the other two speakers. Is there a standard or guidance for the appropriate terminal disposal of pharmaceuticals?
Yes, I could try to answer. I'm not familiar with anyone. I would like to know if there is one.
Can you please repeat the question?
Is there a standard or guidance for the appropriate terminal disposal of pharmaceuticals?
I don't think that there is. I think there are many regional solutions to that. So some have these drug take-back programs. We can, for example, bring them back to a pharmacy. So that this is I think the safest way of getting rid of old medicine, for example. But there are also strategies, for example, that people are encouraged to just put the old medicine into garbage, because if the garbage is being burned in the end, it's not as harmful and it's not as dangerous for the environment as, for example, putting the old medicine, for example, in the toilet and flushing the toilet then. But there are different solutions in different regions, I would say.
Yes, I agree with that answer, and there is not a common standard. Many countries require terminal incineration of pharmaceutical agents. There are also chemical degradation methods that have been developed in UN programs that were supported by the Global Environmental Facility. There's inertization processes for pharmaceuticals. And there is also alkaline hydrolysis that is being used. That is known as chemical cremation, where it's used for, as instead of incineration for cremation. But it's widely expanding in the marketplace, but there is no common standard as of yet. And I see more questions are coming in. There's a question, is there specific reports on antibiotics in the environment? Tim, that's for you.
There are several reviews about pharmaceutical antibiotic occurrences in the environment. So if you can't find them online, I think if you use Google, or if you just, for example, use scientific databases such as sciencedirect.com, you will probably find them. But if you can't find them, just send me an email and I will look it up for you.
Thank you. And here's another comment. It may be worth your while to monitor X-ray or MRI contrast agents, such as iopramide. These are so widespread and readily detected, though not particularly toxic. They make good markers for human activity and inputs to the environment. Tim, do you have anything to comment about that?
Yeah. So we also found lots of X-ray agents in our database, of course, because they are quite easily measurable, because you find them in high concentrations, even at microgram per liter concentrations quite often. But as you said yourself, they are not very toxic because they were designed to not adsorb to anything. So they go through your body, they go through the wastewater treatment plants, but they also go through the drinking water treatment plants systems. So you can also find them, for example, in Germany, with many occurrences of X-ray agents in drinking water. But it's more, it's not really a toxic problem, but it's just more a problem of how to, explain this to the people, that even though you have some drugs in your drinking water, which you don't want to have, of course, but which are not toxic at these concentrations.
Thank you. And with that, I again want to thank Dr. Tim Oosterbeek and Thomas Moller for your presentations today and stimulating discussion. I know that as part of the emerging policy issue of the strategic approach to international chemicals management, that there will be interest in the recommendation to perhaps create a global common list of pharmaceutical agents that should be prioritized for avoiding discharge. And I will bring that up as the civil society health sector representative to the Bureau, and look forward to speaking and working with all of you moving that forward. I wanted to let those of you who are not members of the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals know more about how you can join. We are a network of hospitals, health systems, and healthcare organizations. It is free to join. You can look on the greenhospitals.net website for more information and the application form. All it requires is a signature from an authority and choosing 2 goals from among the 10-goal framework that you will make progress on, and then share your good practices with the rest of the network. I look forward to continuing this conversation on pharmaceutical environmental hazards on the Connect social media platform for the members of the pharmaceutical community on the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals Network. Our next webinar in June will be on the use of antimicrobials in textiles in healthcare settings. A reminder that after this webinar, you'll receive in your server a request for an evaluation. We do care about what you think and may use your comments to improve our webinars, including we would like your recommendations for what topics would be of interest to you. And last, I want to remind you all about submitting abstracts to CleanMed, and I look forward and hope to see you in Copenhagen this October. Thank you and have a great day, evening, and the rest of your morning. Bye.